Hey everyone, it's me, HawkeyeG, and today we're doing a campaign starter guide for the Reikland faction of the Empire race, specifically Karl Franz's version of it. The Empire is a very well-rounded race, and it's a great one for newer players. However, their starting location isn't quite as secure as a lot of other campaigns, and the early phase of the campaign can be pretty volatile as a result. They do have a lot of different options for play in terms of both campaign approach and battle approach, so they really do have good replayability. As always, if you're enjoying these videos, please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel out, and I do really appreciate it when you do. Like usual, we'll be talking about four main things in this guide. We'll be talking about building considerations with some campaign map aspects, the army composition for this faction and how to use them in the campaign, the short-term goals to get you success in the early game and things to focus on, and then long-term strategy to give options on how to proceed to victory. With that being said, let's get in and take a look. Alright, so like I usually do, I jump ahead a little bit here so we can get a look at some different things. The first thing we talk about is building considerations. So generally what this means is we're just talking about if there's any unique buildings that we want to pay special attention to as this faction, or if there are just some things that you should prioritize building, or just some things you might want to keep in mind. One of the first things I want to point out when you're playing as Reikland is that the capital has a bunch of landmark buildings, right? And so if you want all of these buildings and you want to get your hero capacity increased, you're going to need to lose something. Probably like the industry building, right? We have to have the port. We've got all of these different things. You don't need the mages building. I'm building it here just so I can get mages at tier 3 instead of waiting. But if we were to go through and look at all the different options that you have here, like I said, ultimately I usually end up, or in this campaign, I end up having to cut the industry building, like obviously the growth building as well, but if you want to get all the landmarks, you're going to have to make some sacrifices. So it's something to keep in mind and plan ahead for. Another thing to look at is the port of Marienburg. It's just something I want to touch on because I'll talk later in the campaign about whether I think you should take Marienburg or not and present it as an option. So let's actually, if we look at a normal port right here in Altdorf, 200, 400, 800, and 30 growth as it goes up. But the port of Marienburg is a unique port, right? Instead of starting at 200, it starts at 500 income generated and goes up to 2,000 while also increasing the additional, like the amount of trade resources that you produce faction-wide. It's a very, very strong building. It'll give you a lot of income. There's some downsides to having Marienburg, but again, just something I kind of wanted to touch on as we'll talk about it more later. But this is another important building to keep in mind for considerations. Now, if you want to do, I'm going to talk about this in the army composition. If you want to do a more offensive playstyle with like infantry cavalry, you see we have the upkeep reduction for Reiksguard and Greatswords, like I talk about in the faction introduction. Okay, keep in mind that the Empire is one of those factions that needs a support building, right? If you want to get the Greatswords, you need to have the armory. If you want to get Reikswords, you don't need the armory, but you need to build it in a separate city if you want to get it at tier 3, because you can't get them from the capital until tier 4 from this unique building. So you can get Reiksguard at tier 3 in one of these other places. They don't require an armory, but of course you do have some other units here that do require the armory building. So just something to keep in mind. If you're going to go that route, you have to make room for the armory building, and this doesn't really do much for you besides unlock those units and give you recruitment capacity and rank. Another little building that I want to point out actually is over here in Grunberg. You have this pastures building, right? This is the kind of resource building, and while it doesn't actually give you a trade resource, it still does give you a lot of growth. So it's definitely a building to keep in mind. It also gives you that casualty replenishment rate increase, which you do of course get from farms, but you just don't get as much. So this can be actually really useful, not just for growth, but also for just recovering your forces, especially if you end up having to fight somebody. Chance you might go to war with Midland or Nuln, or just in general, once the vampires grow and start coming your way. It's very useful to have. The last thing I want to touch on is putting walls in your border provinces and settlements, right? Now, this is a pretty standard thing. You're going to do this as basically any faction you play as anyway, but I think as the Empire, especially in the early game, it's especially important to make sure that wherever your army is and they're fighting for, that you have walls set up on the other side of your empire, right? You can see I've got walls in Grunberg that I'm probably going to upgrade at this phase of the campaign, just on the off chance that I get attacked from the east. Nuln obviously can't build them yet, but that way I don't have to, like early on, you don't have to spread yourself too thin, and depending on the course the campaign takes, you might end up having a very widespread empire with a lot of flanks. I mean, like I said right in the introduction, this is not as like safe and secure of a campaign as some of the other ones are. So you really want to make sure that whatever frontier you're going to leave alone, that you build walls in. It's a little bit more important as the empire than it is in most other campaigns. With that being said, I think that covers all of the major building considerations that I wanted to talk about. There's really not anything as super special here, just a couple of small things to keep in mind, and again, the army composition thing is really up to you, but we'll talk about that more later, coming up next in the army composition considerations. So for the army composition section, what I want to talk about here is just if there's anything special I think you should do for your army composition for this particular faction that is different from what I would consider standard for this faction otherwise. The only thing that I really have to talk about here for Karl Franz as the Reikland faction is the Reiksguard and Greatswords, right? You have upkeep production for them there, and Karl Franz does have a couple of skills, unique skills in his tree that you can use to increase the abilities of Reiksguard and Greatswords. Greatsword 1, not, really that great, but it's just an option to keep in mind. So to give you an idea of what that kind of playstyle might look like, I've set up a little mock battle here. I mean, you can see the balance of favor is kind of already in our favor. I've tried to create, a sort of balanced army for the opponent, something that you would probably see them use or something similar. And we're going to actually modify it just a little bit here, just so you can see the value of, you can see I don't have any artillery in this army, right? So you would have the weakness, it wouldn't be as great on sieges, but this is a great army to have for field battle, and it's going to do a really good job of countering what your enemy is going to be bringing to the table if you're fighting against the Empire troops. So anyway, I just wanted to have a little mock battle to show and give an idea of what it's going to be like to play with this kind of more aggressive play style with the Greatsword and Reiksguard. Alright, so I played this battle out once so that I don't have to play it and talk about it. But we're going to watch the replay here so you can see kind of how I approach the battle and what I think it should look like if this is going to be your playstyle. So you can see I put the spearmen with shields up front. Now you could go with halberdiers, but spearmen and shields, kind of the same option. The reason that I like the spearmen with shields is because they have a shield, right? That's going to absorb a lot of the missile damage that you're going to get from these units being out front. Now, they do obviously have mortars. That's going to give them an advantage, but you can see the AI is already doing stupid shit by firing at my Reiksguard instead of firing at my actually infantry units. So if you go with this kind of playstyle, and if you do this often, you already know this, but with this kind of playstyle, you just have to accept that you're going to take some losses on the way in. And I actually, you can probably notice it. I kind of alternate between running and walking to conserve some of their stamina, but still keep them a little unpredictable for the mortars. But so you put the spearmen up front to kind of tank some of the damage. These aren't really going to be... They're sturdier units, so they can take the damage, and they won't... they're not really your fighting units, right? These aren't the ones that you want to be doing the damage. They're just the units that you have to pin things in place. So you can see I kind of get my Reiksguard on the flanks. This one's taking some damage, but we don't really care about that, right? We are now poised and ready to hit their front lines. So, of course, they've got some great swords too, like I gave them, but the key here is that once you reach their lines with an army like this, you just chew through them, right? This greatsword, well, somehow he's losing to this halberdier. It looks like they're both losing, whatever. The point being that your greatswords are just going to plow through like all of the melee and missile infantry that they have, and with a decent amount of cavalry like this, you can see their backlines already in almost complete disarray, right? All of their ranged units had a few moments early on. They've got these like a couple units here in the middle that are still okay, but for the rest of this, like their ranged units have almost instantly become useless, whereas mine are just kind of sitting back and firing away. They've got, I don't even have to micromanage these. I can just place these on the line and try to move and adjust melee units as I need to. I like the Celestial Wizard because then you can use the Thunderbolt to try to destroy artillery pieces. You can use the Hex Curse of the Midnight Wind to debuff them. And maybe I moved through this a little bit too fast. I don't want to spend a ton of time on it in the guide, but I mean, that's the point, right? You can see that despite starting with similar numbers and with them having artillery in the beginning, I know that I had a bit of a balance of power and money advantage coming into this. But the point being, you can see that with like you take some damage coming into it, but once the Great Swords and Reiksguards start hitting, once you start disrupting their backline and busting through their front line at the same time, the tide shifts in your favor really quickly. The only thing you really have to watch for is just trying to like micromanage a little bit, pull out some of, like, your spearmen with shields are going to start losing fights, but by the time they're losing fights and taking damage, your Great Swords and archers should be winning, and basically that's how it goes, right? You gotta keep your Reiksguard moving around, keep a couple of them on their missile units in the back, have the rest of them either hitting their artillery or charging, like rear charging their front lines and just cleaning things up. Yeah, pretty straightforward, I think. So hopefully that demonstration helps give an idea of what I'm talking about when I say that you can kind of spec into like Great Swords, Reiksguard, and just have a little bit of support, but play that more offensive playstyle. Yeah, no, that's a pretty beautiful victory screen in terms of overall losses taken. You know, it's a pretty one-sided fight for the outcome of it, and you can see the health of the units. We really only had one greatsword unit take significant damage, and the spearmen got damaged, so yeah. So we're going to look at another demo or two in just a minute here, so you can get some other ideas about army compositions to consider, but I want to talk about them a little bit first, and just discuss the kind of units that I expect to be using. So we're back in pretty early phase of the game, but you can see, if you notice when I was on the main province, I do have the forges built, right? This just came up fairly recently, so I haven't had time to get these into the army, but this is what I would consider a pretty standard composition for the Empire, is like shielded spearmen, and then crossbowmen, and some mortars, right? Your real opponents that you have the potential to face in the early game are the Empire, Bretonia, and the Vampire Counts, right? So what does that mean for us in terms of army composition? Well, I think going up against Bretonia, this kind of standard composition is fine, right? If they have the cavalry buildings and they're bringing a lot of them, you're going to need more crossbowmen, less archers and mortars. However, to siege their cities, you're going to want enough mortars to do that successfully, and whether you know this or not, if you look here, you can see a level 3 settlement, like a minor settlement, still has walls on the settlement, so these are going to be tough nuts to crack. That's why you want to bring the mortars to the fight, 3 or maybe 4 of them. Like I said, it kind of depends on whether you have a pure peasant army like this, which you can easily crush with just these units and a bunch of mortars, or if they really are starting to bring in a bunch of cavalry, you might need to lean a little bit more heavily on your spearmen, or even perhaps halberdiers. Versus the Empire, we already kind of talked about it. You can go into Great Swords and Reiksguard, and of course it depends on what your enemy is going with. They can be very versatile. The standard composition will work on them too, but so you kind of have the Great Swords as the anti-infantry to work against the Empire. It's likely that your enemy is going to bring some cavalry. I wish I could see some here. I could pull up another save, but yeah, the point being, like, you don't necessarily know what they're going to bring. You kind of want to go in either with something standard and well-rounded, spearmen, archers, and mortars to kind of cover all your bases, or you go in with an attack plan, right? Reiksguard, Great Swords, and I'm just going to push them and steamroll them, and it doesn't matter what they have, right? So those are kind of the things you want to think about. But you shouldn't expect to fight the Empire regularly, because it'll hurt your Imperial authority too much. So you can see, like, declared war on Elector Counts, like, you're going to lose Elector Counts along the way, but if you're also declaring war on them, it's just going to hurt your Imperial authority, and I don't recommend that. The other enemy I mentioned in the early game is the Vampire Counts, and basically Hellstorm Rocket Battery. This is the way. Like, you can mirror match their melee infantry if you go into Great Swords, right? You can mirror match their cavalry if you go into Reiksguard, right? But you don't have a mirror matchup for their monsters, right? Their monsters will beat your infantry. You can definitely do well against them with your missile units, but the point is, like, since they don't have missile units or artillery, they're going to be doing the aggressive charge thing to you. So that's kind of the one thing that is the Greatsword and Reiksguard thing still works, but if you're going into Vampire Counts, you don't want to be playing, if you're fighting somebody, you don't want to be fighting a mirror matchup, right? You don't want to put, like, your you don't want to be fighting strength for strength. You want to be going into counters, right? You want to be bringing something like the Hellstorm rocket battery, right? I know I already said it, so I'm just going to look at it again here. This is going to be the thing that easily wins you fights against the vampire counts. And actually, let's go take a look at that. So here's an actual battle that I played against the vampire counts. And you can see, like, we're steadily in tier 4, right? I have the Hellstorm rocket batteries I mentioned, but you can see they have, like, they've got Varghouls and Vargeists, right? They have some scary units. They've got some cavalry, and this army has reinforcements. It seems like I should be outmatched, so we're definitely, there's some concerns to be had here, right? The one other thing that I wanted to mention, but I knew it would come up in this battle, right? I was talking about unit counters that you kind of want. So your Hellstorm rocket battery exists to counter their infantry, right? Look at that. Glorious damage. And so even if they're bringing something, I mean, this army, it really didn't have as much, they don't have Graveguard, right? You don't want to fight their Graveguard with your Reiksguard. You want to fight their Graveguard with your Hellstorm rocket batteries. And so you can see even these, even the cavalry here are taking some decent damage from those rocket batteries. So you really can just get a lot of damage out with these. They're pretty much anything the vampire counts bring are going to be heavily susceptible, and being able to just wipe out their infantry so heavily is going to start putting you at an advantage early on. The other thing that you want to consider is handgunners. Handgunners are going to be a very good counter to both their cavalry and their monstrous units, right? This thing is just going to get torn apart by some handgunners. Now, they have a lot of them, so it's pretty tough, so we'll see how it goes. You can see I've got a very defensive posture, kind of repositioning, but you can see here, right, now the handgunners are starting to get shots off, and despite the fact that these Vargeists are pretty dangerous, Black Knights are scary, we've got multiple units firing at them to weaken them. We don't have enough spearmen to cover all the flanks, so perhaps I should have gone with less, but that's kind of what the Reiksguard are here for too. But I mean, like, look at this. You can see before half of their melee infantry even gets close to us, they're getting decimated. The cavalry's just sitting here on the outside, so you can really burst a lot of this stuff down before it becomes too big of a threat. And that's pretty much it, right? I mean, you can see, like I said, we've got pretty significantly severe, like, numbers disadvantage here. They should be able to surround us easily. Looked like there was some friendly fire on these handgunners here too or something, and not sure what that was. So you can see these battles will devolve pretty quickly. It can be kind of scary once the vampire counts actually hit you. They do a lot of damage, so you need to do as much damage to them as you can. But the point being, like, you can see, despite having half their size, oh, that was a beautiful comet. My god. Yeah, love that spell. Celestial Mage, great option. Like I said, it can also kind of cover for some of the weaknesses, especially if you go for that more aggressive playstyle. But so you can see, right, while we have a couple of problems here, we've got this Varghulf and the Black Coach, but we're basically just trying to keep those things pinned down while we work our way through these units one by one. And that's pretty much it. But you could see just the amount of damage that they take before really getting into the fight kind of sets the tone for these kinds of armies. So even though we were a little outmatched, we definitely had the ability to take it. If you're going with the artillery, you kind of need to adopt more of a defensive posture. As you can see, I'm really treading the line with this army in terms of how much, like, line holding I have versus how much damage dealing I have. If we didn't get out enough damage, or we didn't, kind of micromanage things well enough, very easy to get overrun. But this is just what I wanted to show, is, like, the power of the Hellstorm rocket battery against the vampire counts. The last thing that I want to mention for army composition considerations is chaos, right? Eventually, you are going to be one of the people that's going to primarily fight chaos. It might not really be you by turn 100. In this campaign, actually, Clan Molder gets pretty out of hand, and so they end up fighting chaos a bunch. But most likely by the turn 150 mark on their second appearance, you are going to be the one fighting them. And really, it's a similar approach to the vampire counts, right? You want Hellstorm rocket batteries, and you want Hellblaster volley guns. These do such a significant amount of armor-piercing damage. these are going to tear through any Chaos troops, like of whatever type. And the Hellstorm rocket batteries, Chaos is going to be bringing a lot of like melee infantry to the fight, and the rocket batteries will just tear them apart before they even get to your lines. I think the only thing you really have to consider is trying to balance the number of things you bring, right? Too many Hellstorm rocket batteries, and in general, too much artillery can be hard to protect, and it's so fragile, right? Like, handgunners perform a very similar function to Hellblaster guns. These do a bit more damage, obviously, than the handgunners, but the handgunners are going to be able to run away and just have a slightly better amount of survivability, so maybe you bring some of both. But this, again, just another thing to keep in mind for the late game. And so just to kind of give you some ideas, right, you can go into the infantry and cavalry heavy play style and be aggressive in your fights, take an advanced and aggressive stance, and really make the play yourself instead of letting the enemy make the play and reacting to them. Or you can go into the artillery heavy play style. And the thing is that you're going to want some artillery regardless, most likely, for dealing with those opponents, just because it's a counter, right? I talked about this already. Going into mirror matchups where you're fighting their high-quality melee infantry with your high-quality infantry is not as good as fighting their high-quality infantry with your rocket battery, right? So just some things to keep in mind. With that being said, I think that covers everything that I wanted to for the army composition considerations, so let's move on to the short-term goals and key points for the early campaign. Alright, so we're back here on pretty early game, so I can talk about kind of the finer points of this campaign. When I talk about the short-term goals and the key points, really I'm just trying to give a brief roadmap of any of the significant obstacles you face in the early game, get you through the first 20 to 30 turns or so, and give you an idea of the things you should focus on, as well as what options you have available for you, or if there's anything critical that if you don't take care of, it'll ruin your campaign. So the first thing is similar to pretty much any other campaign. You are going to start at war with a rebel faction that controls a part of your province. You are going to want to take that faction out as soon as possible. So you want to move quickly to eliminate the Empire Secessionists. If you can attack Helmgart with a full army of your own while their army is elsewhere, that does help a lot. Otherwise, it's not too hard to, as you can see I've done now, pin them down and attack, or bait them out using an ambush. You kind of have a lot of options, but really, so this is one of the key points, right? It's pretty easy to clean up this province, but if the rebels here have control of Helmgart, they will be able to keep building armies and recruiting units from here, even though they shouldn't. They can, and they will, and they'll just kind of keep coming after you from here. So taking out this fort is one of the key significant things. It's possible to kind of face rush it early on with just basic spearmen and archers. If you can't do that, you want to get a barracks to level 2, get spearmen with shields and crossbowmen. You should be able to take it on fairly easily at that time. If you can't do that, you kind of have to wait till a little later and come back to fight it with mortars, but that means you're kind of stuck here babysitting it. So really, the sooner you can get here, the better. Now, despite the fact that you saw me pin this enemy in with that spearman and archer army, I was not able to win that fight. I definitely just did not have the number of forces that I needed to win. So we had to take a little bit of a break, come back with spearmen with shields and some archers, right? Or actually crossbowmen is the important piece here. And so you can see it's possible to just brute force this fort. And that's kind of what I was talking about, right? Or that's the term I meant to use. You really want to try to brute force this fort as early as you can. Taking a decent number of losses on easily replaceable units in the early game is not a big deal, right? So you can see we're already taking a lot of damage from focus fire here, but we're taking it on spearmen with shields. Horrible mortar hit to start, right? But it's buying my archers time to get into position and start firing on stuff. We pull the halberdiers out for a moment because they're getting pretty weak. Get the Reiksguard in to try to break through the gatehouse. And basically just push onto the walls, right? Their biggest advantage at the start of this fight is they have so many crossbowmen to hold the walls, but they don't really have a bunch of strong melee. Well, I say that and they're coming around with great swords, but generally, again, you're just kind of trying to brute force it, right? You are using your archers to deal out as much damage as you can. You want to take over the walls with your infantry to try to push them off of it. And with your archers in good enough positions, they'll be able to do damage to those kinds of units. You want to be careful with stuff like, you know, high value targets that get focused early, or especially your handgunners that are just high quality units. And so yeah, you can see we're kind of trading blows. The other big reason to get onto the front lines is, I mean, if you saw there's a mortar shell that hit here, it's very easy for their mortars to end up hitting the walls themselves. So you just kind of force it. You can see my infantry is getting pretty low health, but we're routing a lot of their units, so it's kind of trading one way for the other, but we're slowly kind of getting an advantage. Kind of position some of your missile units off to the side, like the handgunners, and I brought some free company militia for the, like, you know, your gunpowder units, and then yeah, I get a really well-timed breakthrough on the wall here, and so we can just go and shut those mortars down, right? By this time, we already kind of have an advantage, but you can see just having the quality of the crossbowmen and spearmen with shields units, you are able to, like, the spearmen with shields aren't really going to do the damage, but the crossbowmen have the range and damage that you need to be able to brute force this fight. So yeah, it's tough. It's tough to take this fort early on, especially depending on your experience level, but if you really just brute force it and try to push your way through, it's very likely you can do this. And the longer you wait, the better quality of troops and defenses that they're going to have here, so you don't want to wait, because otherwise you're going to be sitting here and waiting until you have artillery to take this one little city. Another big reason that you want to take out this fort early on is, like I said, because you want to eliminate these rebels, right? You need to eliminate the Empire secessionists, because otherwise they'll just live, keep sending armies at you, and you have to babysit them. It's very likely in the early game that somebody like Nuln or Middenland is going to declare war on you, or just in general that some random event will happen with the elector counts and you will be forced to go to war with them. I mean, you can see their fealty is already very low, so you're definitely at a high risk of going to war with these factions. It's very likely an event will happen, so you don't want to be stuck trying to, like, babysit this army and then also have to rush and defend another border. You kind of get pincer attacked. It's not a good time. Okay. So, like I said, just something to keep in mind. Nuln and Middenland, I know I already basically said this just now, but yeah, it's just something, that's another thing to keep in mind. I know it's not really a goal, but it's a key point, right? These two bordering factions are low fealty to you. It's very likely that something will happen that will cause them to attack you, so you kind of need to be aware of that. That's why you want to focus on an offensive in a single direction and building walls in the other direction, like I said earlier. There's also the Marienburg aspect, the question, right? I feel like I don't know if I would say there's debate about whether to take this city or not. You can't confederate them, but you do require the Wasteland province in order to achieve victory, right? So the pros and cons boil down to this. The advantage is you get a very powerful economic city, right? You have you have a trade resource, but we also looked at the unique port that they have in Marienburg and how strong that is. The disadvantage from controlling it is that you get vision over the sea region. That's going to expose you to Norska in the north. It's going to expose you to the Dark Elves here. And if we look at them, you can see they're already at war with both of these people, right? So despite the fact that you're going to get a big economic boost, it's very likely that you're going to have to turn that economic boost. You're just going to have to use that economy to defend this territory anyway. I definitely wouldn't recommend trying to, like, take and maintain these two settlements, like either take them and destroy them or, like, abandon them, whatever. But Marienburg is good. I do typically go for it myself. Like I said, I don't recommend trying to hold these two in the short term, right? You can come back for them later. But if you want, you can move, like, as soon as you wipe out the Empire Secessionists, you move on Marienburg, and depending on how things play out, it's very possible for you to just take Marienburg and this other fort, and then let Marienburg die to other forces, or occasionally Bretonia will come in and sweep them out too, because they're also at war with Bretonia, right? Speaking of Bretonia, I know, well, we can see them, right? They came up on here. So, in terms of Bretonia specifically, right? Not Bretonia, Corone, right? The Corone faction of Bretonia. I usually like to ally with them, make peace with them, try to make deals with them. Simple non-aggression pact and trade agreement will do until later in the game. That being said, Corona is another very valuable, very strong province, right? It's another place that you could just take them out right away, prevent the rest of Bretonia from being able to unify, gain a very powerful province for yourself, and be able to propel your power into the sky, right? Whether or not, like, another aspect of this campaign is that if you're not fighting the Empire early on, who do you have to fight? And one of the answers to that question is Bretonia. So you can be kind of going through here and taking out Bretonian lands instead of allying with them. You just take it for yourself and become very rich. Of course, again, you're exposed on the coast, so it creates another flank for you to get attacked that you have to protect, but it's just something to keep in mind. And quite frankly, I am going to recommend that you at least take 1 or 2 Bretonian provinces at some point in this campaign. So what's it really hurt if you just add 1 more to that list? I don't know. It has its pros and cons as well. A lot of the times if you leave Corona alive, they'll become strong enough to start taking out Norska for you. That is just the best thing in the world when you don't have to do this mess yourself. But yeah, they have a powerful province and you can just propel your strength upwards greatly, especially if you can destroy Bretonia when it's still fractured into several different factions. So this leads to what I would say is my focus for the early stages of the game. You basically, like, you kind of do this land grab early on for like Marienburg and Reikland, but once you have that, I do think you want to play fairly defensive. An important thing that you want to get to, and I already talked about this, but for short-term goals, like the first one is wiping out the Empire Secessionists, second is an optional taking Marienburg, third is getting Hellstorm rocket batteries. Getting a powerful piece of artillery to fight the vampires with is one of your short-term goals. You won't be able to do it by turn 30, obviously, because you won't be able to get your city to tier 4 by then, but that's something you want to do in the early game, right? The vampire counts are very likely to go strong, and it's very likely they will come for you before too long in this campaign. The other reason you want to play defensively is because you can confederate everybody anyway. You want to let your fealty build with all the Empire factions so that you can start gathering Imperial authority, and then use that to just confederate people when you're ready to do it, right? Every time you decline a confederation, you get additional authority. And so, like, basically going around and fighting all of the Empire factions next to you is going to hurt you more than it helps you. It'll give you, you know, some advantages in the early game, but it'll be really hard to recover your authority into the late game. The rest of the early game is pretty much about reacting to the events, right? Did you get Helmgart early, or did you have to wait for better units of your own? You know, that kind of determines how far out you can push early on. Did Middenland or Nuln attack you, or did some other group attack you, right? If you get attacked by one of the Elector counts, that kind of gives you a more immediate objective to deal with. But if you're able to use your prestige to suppress the events, then you are going to have the freedom to kind of do what you want. So basically, are you able to prevent wars and pursue specific targets in a timely fashion is the main question. So the Empire campaign really takes a shape of its own without you having to direct it too much. Like I said, a lot of these random events will change the course of your campaign. It also means that things can just outright go wrong. It happens sometimes as the Empire. You should not feel bad about restarting a bad series. One of the first time I played the Empire after they received their major rework, this Empire Secessionist faction actually recruited Gotrek and Felix, and they bashed me. It was so dumb, and I was very frustrated by it. But just know that sometimes a bad series of events will happen, and you might lose. Okay. The last thing to mention then. So I'm talking about, you know, this is a faction where early on you kind of want to bunker down and build up because you need to be ready to fight the vampires in the future, right? That's kind of your that's like the end, the last short-term goal you have is be ready to fight the vampires. In the meantime, however, there are a lot of like smaller nearby targets, right? You've got the Crooked Moon here. You've got the Barrow Legion here. You even have the Wood Elves and some Greenskins here. So you have a lot of like small single targets that you can go around and just kind of pick off one by one. And that way you're not committing to a long drawn out war with a full-sized faction. You're just kind of knocking somebody out that is never going to be friends with you in the first place. And so you can kind of take care of them that way. The other thing is, depending on the pacing of like how quickly you take out Empire secessionists, whether or not you take out Marienburg. It's very advisable to take out some of Bretonia. Let's take a look at that. So you can see, these are the kinds of things I'm talking about with pacing and short-term goals. Right here at what I'd consider the end of the early game, I had Nuln declare war on me and attack me. I took their capital and then just made peace with them. And this actually gives you the elector count slot, so you can make use of that. I took Marienburg, like I said, and then these territories have just been kind of traded back and forth between Bretonia and the Dark Elves and the Norska, right? They're all kind of trading around. I was able to eliminate the Greenskins at Carrick Asgaraz. I also was able to take Blackstone Post for myself because I had Grungzint from Marienburg as well, and I took out the Bastogne faction, so I have another little cute province here that I can just develop as an economic supply province. So this turned out really well for me. I think personally, if you're still newer to the game, or this is your struggle with this campaign, or you just have a bad stretch of luck, this is ideal in my opinion. I'm sure people can do better than this, but this is ideal for turn 50, right? I've eliminated all of these petty minor threats. I've established good relations with the people that I want to have good relations with that are nearby. We're actually, despite taking Nuln, we still have really good fealty with them. And so you can see I haven't really expanded a ton, but I've secured a lot of valuable things and eliminated a lot of minor threats. And this is already bleeding into the long-term strategy. So let's just recap. Short-term goals are to eliminate the Empire secessionists as fast as possible. You want to brute force this fort before they can level it up too much. Otherwise, what you have to do is wait till you get artillery and you can besiege it properly. You have the option to take Marienburg early on, depending on your pacing. You also have the option to take some Bretonian provinces, depending on your pacing, right? Those are some of your short-term goals, but the key thing is to just react correctly to any events that happen to keep yourself safe and ultimately begin preparing for the vampires. Since they added in Drycha, I've noticed the vampires do not grow as far and as fast as they really used to in the past. When they first did the Empire rework, when they did the vampire count rework after that, they're ridiculous. But they're still going to they're going to start winning. It's just a little bit slower now. So you need to be ready for that eventually. And as you can see, we're almost ready for it right here at the end of the early game. So, talking about long-term strategy, what this section is really about is just kind of giving you options for how do I progress from this point in the campaign right here into a successful end game, right? I think the short-term goals I discussed are fairly straightforward, and it's a pretty balanced campaign at this time. What I would say is it's hard to say there's any wrong moves throughout the campaign. It's more about reacting correctly. It's not about making moves of your own, but it's reacting correctly to enemy moves, and that's why I do suggest a defensive playstyle. You can definitely go offensive playstyle with some of the bonuses you have, but we've talked about that enough, I think. The long-term strategy of this campaign can take many different routes, but ultimately the main points are these. Continuing to build up is important. Reaching technological and military superiority is more important than expansion as this faction, especially with the Confederation mechanic through Imperial authority. Trying to establish good relations with the Empire factions is important, because better relations with them will give you better... do we have high relations as 0 on here? So we don't have good enough relations with them yet, but that'll just get you to the high fealty quicker and get you authority quicker. Prepare for the vampire counts in the midterm and the Warriors of Chaos in the long term. These are your two main obstacles. And then, like I said, in this campaign, let's go look at it. So I wanted to actually hop in on this turn real quick as well and kind of show you what I'm talking about. You can see I keep talking about preparing for the vampire counts, and 10 turns ago, you probably would have said, why? They're still in their starting province. Well, these settlements that I've taken from Stirland, I didn't take from Stirland, I took from the vampire counts. And you can see they're also successfully pushing north here and taking out, I don't even know how this territory did they, well, whatever. You can see they're already starting to expand right at this phase. And if I wasn't ready for them already and wasn't already pushing them back, they would be rapidly starting to make progress in all directions. So, like I said, just something you want to be aware of. And this is why you need to prepare for this, because when they're ready to push out, they're going to do so very successfully. So here we're a little bit further in now, and this kind of shows some of the things I was talking about. First of all, you can see my empire is spread very wide. I took a few more Bretonnian provinces to get under my control, and taking out the vampires. Like the reality is, while you're waiting for your authority to build, if you're not like fighting the elector counts, or you're not confederating some of them, you kind of have no choice but to go wide, right? You have to go wide to reach into vampire territory, and if you decide to attack Bretonnia, you're going to be wide on this flank. So it's why you really want to make sure that you have walls set up in as many of your fringe provinces as you can, to make sure that you don't have to invest as much like into defending them with your military. But you can see here, right, we're not even starting to push them back yet, but if I can find Clan Mulder in this list, right here, I'm looking at the wrong list, 15 settlements, it's a pretty decent amount, right? That means they've wiped out Kislev, they control a lot of this, and you can see they're starting to really push down from the north. And I think it kind of makes sense with the introduction of Drycha, because the Drycha and the vampire counts are kind of like... There's enough unbalance in this region here that Clan Mulder is essentially left to their own devices up here. And if they can overcome Kislev, then they really start to push out into the south. So it's something that you have to consider being prepared for. You might want to be taking the ambush defense chance. We don't have it here, actually. Sorry, never mind. But yeah, the Skaven are very likely to grow and push out, so they may be an intermediate threat. Of course, this will be at the time, like a little bit past the time that Chaos has spawned, so Chaos is going to start ruining everything for them, and you'll be able to push through, right? As you move into this more, like here's the end of the mid game, we're about to move into the late game, you do need to be ready to react to the appearance of Chaos. You should also be kind of cleaning up if there's any of those minor threats left, like the greenskins here or whatever other tiny stuff. Take care of them. You know, I took out the vampires of Musion over there. But you want to be ready for Chaos, right? You need to also be capable of fending off raids from Norska and potentially the Dark Elf raids on your territory, walls and coastal settlements, and having an army or two in the area to ambush is going to go a long way to help. Your focus should really be clearing out any non-Empire factions in Empire lands and then pushing to the northeast to meet Chaos head-on. If you can establish a nice defensive line or perimeter, a lot of the times what I end up like right here, like Castle von Rocken, Zavastra, and Kislev, having this like stretch right here, this is a nice, very easy to defend flank. It does kind of leave this northern flank open for them to circle around, but you just need to make sure that you're scouting that with some heroes to be able to catch them off guard. The key to fighting Chaos, really they're not as scary as they were in game 1. They can still win against you if you're not prepared. There's two big things. You need armor piercing, right? Halberdiers, great swords, handgunners, Hellstorm rocket batteries, Hellblaster volley guns, right? We already talked about a lot of that stuff, but those are the kind of weapons that you can use to defeat Chaos pretty easily. Lightning Strike is also an extremely useful skill here. The way that the Chaos troops move across the board, they tend to stay grouped up where you'll have like 2 or sometimes 3 Chaos armies that stay within reinforcement range of each other. If you have Lightning Strike, you can take them on one by one, and even if you take some heavy losses, if you're wiping out, like, if you're beating, you know, 2 armies in a one-on-one in a row, you can take some losses, and that is fine, because you'll have cleaned them up pretty heavily, right? You can also, one little last thing, having a great cannon to bring in to try and snipe out the enemy hell cannons, because you're going to have the range on them, and then you can kind of eliminate Chaos's one artillery unit without really having to risk like your cavalry or a mage. It can be nice. This is just a niche suggestion if you're struggling with the hell cannon. Typically they'll hurt you, but like I showed in that early battle replay where I took the aggressive play style, if you do that, you just have to, again, it's an artillery piece, you have to accept some losses and then just push forward through it, and well, especially if you bring some artillery of your own, you're going to do a lot more damage than they will. So I think that covers everything for the long-term strategy. Really, it's just a continuation of the position you put yourself in from the short-term goals, right? You keep building Imperial authority so you can confederate everybody, and you essentially just keep preparing for the next enemy as you push to the east and then to the north and prepare to repel Chaos. Once Chaos invades and is successfully defeated,
it's pretty much a wrap for you. You might have to worry about the greenskins in the south. In this campaign, I was able to help the dwarves out enough to keep them in a good position. And the greenskins always end up losing momentum in their late game anyway, like even in the mid game sometimes. So yeah, basically you're just trying to build up the authority to confederate everybody, counter chaos, and that should pretty much take you to where you need to be. So that covers everything that I wanted to for this guide. This one's definitely a little longer than some of the past ones. Let me know in the comments if you want me to be more detailed like this, or if you want me to keep these brief. I feel like the shorter videos probably do get more watches, but I think that there's a decent number of points to consider and a good amount of strategy, and there's just so many options in this campaign. It's hard not to talk about too many things at once. So with that being said, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned some things today. Again, if you are liking the content, please don't forget to like and subscribe. I really appreciate it, and it always helps the channel out a lot. Thank you for watching. Have a great day, and we'll see you on the next one.